Yo, it's the Chlorinde. Beta is over. Chlorinde is finished cooking. We hopefully know whether or not she's a free character. On the screen now. Who is Chlorinde? She's an on-field electro attack scaling DPS, or central mechanics. It's not what you've heard this one before. Bond of Life. When Chlorinde has Bond of Life, she cannot be healed. Except this is where it gets different. Any incoming healing besides healing generated from her own elemental skill is converted into additional Bond of Life. Why does that matter? What does she use Bond of Life for? When she has over 100 Bond of Life, she should use her elemental skill to do 3 additional normal attacks. She can technically use her elemental skill in her elemental skill stance at any time. For simplicity's sake, we're going to refer to the elemental skills as lunges. So when Chlorinde has over 100% Bond of Life, she can lunge. How else does she generate these lunges? Every normal attack she does within the Night Watch state triggered by her elemental skill gives her 35% Bond of Life. So her gameplay loop looks like N3E, 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 burst sometimes. The other method by which she does damage is her passive called Dark Shattering Flame. Yes, this passive does sound like it came directly out of Arlecchino's kit. No, it is not part of Arlecchino's kit. It has a reaction trigger quota. 3 reactions have to be triggered, and they can be 3 of the same kind of reaction, so we can effectively ignore the trigger quota for this and assume it is always maxed, because it will always be maxed. The situations where you don't use this are solo Chlorinde. This just in. Chlorinde cannot solo Abyss. Trash character. But yeah, if you actually don't care about that, like a sensible person. Dark Shattering Flame ends up being a significant portion of Chlorinde's total damage, roughly 35-40%, depending whether or not you burst. It also buffs her burst. Any instance of normal attack or burst damage, it is increased by this value. It is currently 0.2 per stack, 3 times, 60%. So she gets an extra 60% talent damage every normal attack instance. If you didn't know, all of her damage is normal attack damage. Her elemental skill does normal attack damage. Her elemental skill does normal attack damage. Her burst does not do normal attack damage, but Dark Shattering Flame applies to her burst anyway. It might as well do normal attack damage. Her talent priority. Despite all of her damage being normal attack damage, don't level her normal attack. She doesn't use it. It doesn't do anything. Her talent priority is E skill. You can also level her burst if you want. Also, I need to add, whenever Chlorinde uses her elemental skill, any bond she possesses is cleared. Because her normal attacks generate bond in increments of 35, you're creating excess bond, which goes directly into her HP, so she heals herself every N3E. Additionally, Chlorinde has a passive that gives her plus 20% crit rate. She is also a crit rate ascension character, so she starts with 44% crit rate, which can make building high crit rate weapons difficult. It's also the reason I am not going to be recommending Jade Cutter. Weapons. Really straightforward. Chlorinde can effectively use any 5-star sword. Her best in slot weapon is going to be the new one, Absolution. Absolution is a high base crit damage weapon, which gives an extra 20 crit damage, and it gives 48 damage percent. Worth mentioning, if you already own any other 5-star weapon, Chlorinde's C1 is better than owning Absolution. That is, if you have Mistsplitter, if you have Harankapaka Futsu, where when you have an R5 Black Sword, it becomes more of a toss-up between C1 and Absolution. But if you already have a 5-star weapon, you already have a 5-star weapon. Her C1 is technically better. Her next best in slot is Mistsplitter Reforged. I mentioned this earlier. You want to talk about power creep? Mistsplitter gives 40 damage percent, is a high base weapon, and has 44.1 crit damage. Absolution gives 48 damage percent and an extra 20 crit damage. Gotta love it. Her next best in slot weapon is Harankapaka Futsu. Harankapaka Futsu is the Iaido weapon. It gives 31.1 crit rate and 42% normal attack damage. It's just pretty good. The Black Sword is the original Battle Pass sword. This is technically your best in slot 4-star weapon at R5. Lower refines get beaten out by the next 2 weapons we're going to mention, which are Finale of the Deep and Lion's Roar. Lion's Roar at R5 is what you should use. If your Lion's Roar is, let's say, R1, you should use Finale of the Deep. Finale of the Deep is the craftable. Because of how this weapon works, it creates a bond of life, and when you heal off a bond of life, you get attack. Because Chlorinde generates her own Bond of Life, which she also entirely heals off, you just get the maximum possible attack from this weapon. It has a maximum of 300, she always gets 300, which is really nice. Artifacts. Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy, 4-piece frog. This set gives 54 damage percent, 18% attack. It gives so many stats. It's just potentially the best set in the game if you can use it. Chlorinde is our second on-field Bond of Life DPS. She's able to stack it. Very good set. Gives a lot of stats. Now, the caveat is Fragment of Harmonic Whimsy might not end up being the overall best in slot for her in terms of team DPS on paper. That's where we get to talk about Thundering Fury. Thundering Fury reduces her cooldown from 16 seconds to 12 seconds or less. It does the same damage as 2-piece, so it's like 18% behind in terms of single elemental skill damage compared to Fragment Harmonic Whimsy. But you might find it useful for playing around teams and getting additional damage out of Fischl. Your experience may vary, and this does need to be investigated in-game. I'm just gonna mention that TF is an option and can theoretically perform the same in terms of clear times or better. The damage difference on paper, in my opinion, is not enough for Thundering Fury to be an overall best in slot recommendation, but it very much could prove to be the case when she releases. Let's talk about a set I don't recommend. Echoes of an Offering. Her best in slot set can feasibly be Echoes. Vertically invest into your geolocation for the best results. Make sure you have under 50 ping. It's not even optimal this time. It's roughly the same as 4-piece Glad. Low ping locations for each server. Virginia, East Coast, United States, Frankfurt, Germany, Tokyo, Japan, Hong Kong, or Shanghai, China. There's also Gladiator's Finale, which is the same damage as Echoes, but a mandatory resin investment. Both sets are available in the Strongbox. And I want to mention her burst, while it does damage, it can be seen as disposable the same way Riesle's is. I'm gonna try Shimenawa's on her. It's theoretically just not a good recommendation and worse than Gladiator, but I want to try it because I happen to have a set already. Main stats. Yo, she's an Electro character. So obviously you're gonna play Hybrid. You're gonna build EM Sands, EM Goblet, EM Circlet. But if you're not doing that, you're gonna run an Attack Sands, an Electro Goblet, or a Crit Circlet. Bad. Constellations. Chlorinde C1 gives her additional normal attacks on a 1.2 second cooldown. The C1 triggered normal attacks are in a separate ICD group to her regular normal attacks. I didn't mention it before, all of Chlorinde's normal damage is standard ICD, but she always hits in intervals of 3, so it's always at least 1 aggravate per action, so N3 1 ag and E 1 ag. Technically you'll get an extra one due to timer rule reset somewhere in the middle of her rotation, doesn't matter. C1, normal attacks. They are part of a unique ICD group, which is purely timer based on a 1 second timer. So no matter what, whenever you trigger C1, you're getting 1 aggravate if you're playing in an aggravate team. This ends up being 28-40% damage increase depending on team, gearing, and whether or not you use Chlorinde's burst. The higher end is on 4TF at extreme amounts of EM without using her burst. Each C1 normal attack also applies her Dark Shattering Flame, which is why I didn't mention the talent damage. The default talent damage is it's like 30 for the C1, except it adds the 60 from Dark Shattering Flame, so it just ends up being the same as everything else she does. C2 alters the effect of Chlorinde's Dark Shattering Flame from 20% to 30% per stack. This results in about 15-20% additional damage depending on whether her damage is reacted or unreacted and Chlorinde's current attack value. C3 is her E skill. This ends up buffing her normal attacks. However, this is not as good as normal attack plus 3 is for someone like Nivelette or Arlecchino. It ends up being about 5% damage because most of her normal attack damage is from her passive, which gets buffed by C2 and is independent of talent level. So C3 kind of sucks. C4 is the Wanderer C2, 200% burst damage, depending on your current bond. Nice. C5, plus 3 burst. Nice. C6 is another 6 normal attacks. These share ICD with C1, so they will not be applying Electro. Each C6 normal attack gets triggered when she is about to be hit or when you use her lunge. Each one is 200% plus the Ascension passive. Also, whenever she is about to be hit, the incoming damage is reduced by 80%. So effectively, when you have Chlorinde C6, when she gets hit, she says no you and hits the enemy instead. General gameplay guide. N3E, 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 N3E. Use the burst at the start or end of her field time, or separate. Teams. Aggravate teams are where I feel Chlorinde can really shine easily. What makes Chlorinde unique is that while she is a normal attack character and an on-field DPS, much like a bunch of other Electro characters, she heals herself. Chlorinde has a self-sustained passive, which can make healerless teams a lot more approachable and a lot more recommendable, and honestly a lot better, because this also applies when you play Furino. That being said, at C0, Chlorinde's interruption resistance isn't great. You may want to shield anyway, so I am pretty happy to still recommend Baiju or Kirara. Using Nahida is a very good idea, especially if you have Constellations on Nahida. You can use any Dendro character without much of a damage difference if your Nahida is C0. Technically, Kirara can actually be a DPS gain on paper, and she gives you a shield. It's kind of pog. You can additionally use Sucrose just as easily as Kazuha, whether Sucrose is on TTDS or Hakushin Ring or Sack Frags. It's all pretty good. Now, I mentioned Furina. Unlike the Aggravate teams, if you play Hyperbloom, you can't replace Nahida. She is the only option. That being said, with your last slot, you can choose to use Fischl or Kuki Shinobu. Fischl is preferable because of Chlorinde's self-healing passive. So Sino, but you can actually play healerless teams. Pretty cool idea. Worth mentioning for the Hyperbloom teams, Chlorinde also has no off-field Electro app, which is why I'm very happy to recommend, or very quick to recommend, the second Electro character, whether that be Fischl or Shinobu. Since Chlorinde has no off-field Electro app, you will only be proccing Hyperblooms while Chlorinde is on field. Also, when you do play Hyperbloom, EM weapons such as Iron Sting become very valuable. Outside of Dendro, let's talk about Overload and Electro Charged. Overload teams have been entirely taken over by Chevres. Maybe this will be the one where Chevres is on banner. Right, guys? This has to be the one. I can't keep saying this 3 videos in a row. This has to be the one. Because of the attack cap on Chlorinde's Dark Shattering Flame, playing both Bennett and Sara together may not be as effective as only using one or the other. Alternative to Sara is Fischl or Beidou. So teams you look at, Chlorinde, Sara, Chevres, Xiangling, Chlorinde, Sara, Chevres, Toma, Chlorinde, Sara, Chevres, Bennett, Chlorinde, Fischl, Chevres, Bennett, etc., etc. On paper, at C0 with a 4-star weapon, Fischl is higher damage than Sara for overall team DPS, but that may not be true in practice. You could say Bennett, Fischl, Chevres, Chlorinde. You could say their relationship's pretty beneficial to each other.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Electro Charged. Electro Charge, pretty straightforward. You can play with Furina, Yela, and Xingqiu. Nice interruption resistance. Kazuha is always comfortable. Play with Fischl again. Yeah. What do I think about Chlorinde? On paper, I can tell you objectively, Chlorinde is very similar to Raiden at any constellation level, and C6 Kutzing for Aggravate specifically. What does that really mean? It means if you already have these characters, there may not be a ton of reason to pull for Chlorinde. She does have very good constellations. She has a very good 5-star weapon, more so than other characters. But yeah, otherwise, I think Chlorinde is pretty cool. She's very in line and samey with a lot of things we already have. She may not be the most impactful character in the game. I'm not sure what Chlorinde's reception will be. There's a chance people really latch onto her because she'll be easy to play, or people will be surprised by how good she is because there's a current undercurrent or opinion of Chlorinde being terrible since she got nerfed in beta. But she also got buffed in beta before that, so she ended up being about the same as she was initially. Things went full circle, basically. She might end up surprising people, she might end up disappointing people. It's a little hard to tell. But yeah, those are my opinions about Chlorinde. Pretty solid character. Pretty normal. Pull her if you like her.